I was lucky enough to get my copy of Private Eye this morning, and I do like Private Eye, and there were a couple of cartoons that amused me. This was the first one. I don't know whether you can see the caption there. It's a bit like what's happening in our house. But a more pertinent cartoon is this one, in which the caption is, "I'll be glad when all this creativity is over and we can get back to normal." So we've been treated in recent times to this extraordinary phrase, the new normal. And my question is really, who will determine what the new normal is? So I've got a couple of thoughts about this. The first one is to consider just this kind of idea of lockdown. And many of you will know I've got a strong interest in the use of geography as a way of understanding detached youth work. So it implicitly talks about constraints to our accessing of public space. And of course, detached youth workers historically are people who move in public space and are interested in and concerned to observe, as has been said, the movements of young people, what in geography they might call mobilities, or in the current context, the immobilities of young people, the things that kind of constrain their movement. I've been in conversation with a pal who lives in Barcelona, and of course this week we've seen images of the people there, young people there, who have literally, for the first time in 6 weeks, been allowed out of their houses and homes. And this kind of idea of being free to actually be outside, as Ruth mentions, it seems really quite extraordinary to us because we've had these freedoms. So in the support work I've been doing for local detached youth workers, we've really tried to encourage young people to take some exercise. And yet, as has also been mentioned by Mike, we've got this extraordinary diversity of response to the situation we're in which some young people are quite literally terrified to go outside of their homes, and others, they seem to have kind of carried on regardless. But these kind of everyday over the fence conversations seem peculiarly important in sort of teasing out the reasons for these anxieties, or indeed the lack of anxieties about COVID-19. So, you know, it's one thing for everybody to be subject to messages through the media, but it's another and a valuable other when detached youth workers can actually have those kinds of conversations. And of course, they can lead into further conversations about what some people have called fake news and conspiracy theory in relation to COVID-19. This particular document was written in early March and by the Federation for Detached Youth Work, and subsequently we put it on one side and wrote another one because what changed was the concept of lockdown. And in this document, which I think we're going to have to revisit soon, we talked about things that you could do that were kind of safe and outdoors. One of the examples I gave that I stole from people who've been doing it, it was playing frisbee. And now I recognise there's probably some issues with people being in contact with a frisbee, but the idea was that there were things you could do where people would be spaced out outdoors, but still outdoors and enjoying being outdoors. So we'll have another look at this document because it may now come back into operation, if you like, given the likelihood that some freedoms are going to come in the next few weeks that we haven't had under lockdown. So there's a context to being outside, and most of us are certainly on message when it comes to the value of that as an environment for taking a bit of exercise. Similarly, the value of it as an experience that supports positive mental health. And that sort of takes me to a broader question about how we might engage with a health agenda in the future. You know, the horrors of perversely reaching the top of the league tables for the numbers of deaths in Europe. There's a complex picture here, but it's absolutely clear that we know that the health profiles of nations are really quite critical to the effect of the virus on people. And if you're fit and well, generally speaking, there'll be modest effects on you and you'll recover quite quickly. But if you're not so well, then, you know, it really becomes risky to contract COVID-19. So it's been said before, but, you know, we live in a poorly nation, and it may be that public space work, if we can call it that, becomes increasingly important and needs to be increasingly important in the future. So this kind of idea that we might really, really try to value public space much, much more. One of the things that's fascinated me, just a quick image that I should have showed you a moment ago to underline the point I've just made, but one of the things that's fascinated me is some of the attempts to try to keep people safe in moving in our communities. And you will have seen these in towns and cities across Britain, and increasingly they come into place. And what they are practical measures to create space for cyclists and pedestrians to actually be able to socially distance as they move around. But what's peculiarly interesting is that it involves a reduction of road space. It's a limiting of the car. And that, of course, has got an extraordinary resonance with concerns that have been growing in recent years about climate change, which is the top of the list for young people's concerns about their futures. So we have this kind of temporary situation in which there are multiple benefits for young people, for their health, living in environmental conditions that are less polluted, for their sociality, and perhaps because we're more present in public space, getting it a little bit less in the neck, you know, for being outside, because we value it differently. We know that people will have to get outside. This image came to me recently. The idea that, you know, we as practitioners could be involved and really should be involved in a future where we start discussing how we use the space in our towns and cities and villages very much more differently. And an image from Berlin recently, where the streets are literally empty of cars and young people. It's almost like an image from the 1950s or something, where young people are going back to using ordinary streets as places to play. So, you know, the question then becomes, you know, can we secure these temporary gains and be involved in a kind of a discussion about the future of the environments in which we live? Now, of course, on the other side of that coin is this age-old discussion that existed in the last webinar about social control. And we've had references again to detached youth workers being contacted by the police saying, you know, there's young people down there congregating, can you go and sort them out? We prefer that your friendly approach takes place rather than us going in heavy-handedness. So, but we know we've got legislation on the statute books now, and it is worth saying that the Coronavirus Act, it's been put on the statute books for 2 years. So I suspect there's a general acceptance of its value at this moment, but there is an important question about its longevity. You know, the arguments were literally lost to say that we should have this act in place on a rolling programme, reviewed every 3 months to establish its value. But it's there now for 2 years. And if you read the detail of it, what you'll find is that there are extraordinary new powers to stop and search people and so on and so on. So I'm really making an argument that in the future, as it comes forward, we need to avoid a kind of a linear thinking in which we think, well, we keep people safe and then we'll argue about, you know, their rights. These need to be parallel conversations. It's not about either or. You know, the future it could go 2 ways. We could get, as I've suggested, this possible wider valuing of public space, or we could get the increased use through the back door, if you like, of stop and search systems that have been so harmful in many, many communities. It's complicated, but My sense is that we need to be involved in these multiple conversations at the same time. Now, of course, the other side of that dystopian position is what we've observed in all our communities, in which detached youth workers have been extraordinarily involved in, is this kind of civic goodwill. You know, on my own street, you know, people that I've known by sight but never really communicated with. There's people are kind of helping each other. So there's a question about whether this will constitute also a temporary phenomenon, and whether we can, as detached youth workers, secure some kind of long-lived community capacity that builds upon the volunteering of people who have never ever volunteered before. You know, people involved in the distribution of food, doing shopping for others, checking in on the elderly, giving them, you know, making telephone calls. So we've got a kind of a heightened sense of values, community value, solidarity, mutual help, care, compassion, cooperation. They're the lifeblood of many of the values that have informed the history of detached youth work. And again, you know, the question about whether it can keep this values conversation alive is important, because, you know, will the new normal, as it's called, you know, see a shift in these values? And I have been a critic of policy in recent years, because, as I'm sure many of you will appreciate, that that we've seen policy drivers much more into targeted, individuated kind of work. So I suspect we have an opportunity now to broaden out again and start trying to talk the language of community work, detached youth work as a form of community work. In terms of values, some of them become stark. I'm thinking about the value of equality, or more pertinently, inequality. I've had conversations with colleagues in Newham recently, and of course we find that Newham has really been hit hard, as a reference to Sunderland in the chat room. But, you know, the 144 deaths per 100,000, you know, it's the top of the list. What a list to be the top of. The mortality rate's the worst in England and Wales. Brent not far behind, Hackney not far behind, and we know what the story is. We're talking about health inequalities and hydro inequalities, but the stark reality is that these are twice the levels in the more advantaged areas. The top 10% of most deprived wards, yeah, twice the levels of mortality than the wealthiest 10%. And we're told, of course, ironically, that COVID-19 is a leveller. Yeah, I mean, it's simply not true. We know in places like Newham, my colleague alluded to the context in Walsall, we've got extraordinary rates of existing deprivation. It's not new deprivation. We've got diversity, we've got vulnerable populations, we've got more than half of children living in poverty, in temporary overcrowded accommodation, in intergenerational households. Yeah, in Newham, there are 36,000 people not paid the legal minimum wage. The Resolution Foundation today tells us that a further 600,000 young people are going to be unemployed because of COVID-19. So I move to a point about perhaps a more political future for us as detached youth workers. As a member of the international network, I got the job of writing the international political statement, and talking to colleagues all over the world. They all said to me, when you write this, Graeme, you need to make sure that that this is a political document. So I draw your attention quickly to some of the things that it says in there. You know, we've got this sense that we've got an approach, yeah, a preventative approach that doesn't just favour individuals targeted within it, it favours all people in society. There's a concern in this document that we could face a further era of austerity after this, yeah? And yet there's this optimistic position that we put into the statement. The statement's available on the Fed website. It's important that we see this pandemic as perhaps peculiarly an opportunity. It shows that we are capable of taking radical measures to respond to emergencies. Homeless people have been housed, yeah, for the first time in a generation. We know we can do these things, yeah. we should know also that 20% of those that were housed have subsequently left that accommodation because of claims of antisocial behaviour, or they can't cope with the institutionalised environment. So there'll always be a need for street work. And in this final point, we've got this kind of awareness that if we can tackle these kinds of issues, we can tackle others, environmental issues, economic issues, social issues, democratic issues, but overwhelmingly what we're going to need is some solidarity in doing it. So I think there's a place there for political education and the recognition that politics is a social phenomenon, and we can use the social dimensions of our work to encourage young people to get involved in politics, encourage their self-advocacy. But the social also represents something that we really have found out is so, so important to young people. You know, young people have told us that this is what they value more than anything: hanging out with their pals, a hug from a grandparent, you know. So these are kind of core values that sometimes this kind of technical approach to youth work has passed by a little bit. And I hope in the future we can regain that. There's an interesting thing about all these people who've come out of the woodwork to support in the education and learning of children at this time. So I think there's a conversation for us to be involved in about the future of learning, the future of education, you know, the future of what it is, you know, what the concepts of the school. And my final point is about, again, it's a favourite topic of mine, I know, but it's about how time works. You know, what we've got and what we've seen for the first time in the lives of many workers, detached youth workers and others, is we've had a little bit of space to have a good think about the future. I talked recently to an organiser from the National Education Union who's always on the case of teachers about how we can make schools a better place to be. And they always say, I've got no time to do this, to get involved in this conversation. And now they have, yeah. This is a picture of Michael Apple, the educational theorist. I remember reading his thesis on intensification. He said that teachers are deliberately kept busy, overloaded in work, not to increase the productivity of schools, but rather to eliminate spaces for dialogue in which conversations, criticisms of, you know, what education is like in the modern world can be made. And I suspect that's been part of our life as detached youth workers. You know, we always say we haven't got time to sit down and talk and argue about what's important. So if there was anything that I hope we can carry forward into the future, is this peculiar experience we've had in joining in webinars and whatever else, where we can start imagining a new future for young people and detached youth work. Thank you.